Hi everyone. For today's class, what we're going to do is continue to go through the social psychological dimension of our course framework and focus on how social psychology connects to the subtopic of social class. So when looking at social psychology and social class, we can look at it in two different ways. We can look at how people recognize class symbolism, basically how different meanings are attached to different symbols, and we kind of use those meanings to place people to social class categories. The other aspect we can look at between social psychology and class is basically how one's class position shapes social psychology. And we talked about this a little bit already in the Leroux book. Leroux talked about how different class positions of families shapes different social psychological ways in the kids. Knowing how to manage your time wisely, being creative, all those social psychological attributes were tied to the family's class position. So we'll talk about that a little bit further today, the connection between how class position shapes social psychology. And then for your next in-class assignment, what you're going to do is actually focus on how we use class symbolism. So how we social psychologically, recognize different meanings and we associate those meanings with classes. So overall, we can move into today's article and basically say we're looking at the psychology of social class, maybe the psychology of social hierarchy as they talk about in the article. So basically, when looking at the connection between class and psychology, we're looking at how class influences subjective well-being. So subjective well-being is something that we've looked at twice already in the semester. Basically, how you feel about yourself. Do you have personal satisfaction? So basically, that's what we're looking at. Does one's class position influence somebody having a positive self-well-being? You feel good about yourself, or perhaps can it contribute to you having lower levels of subjective well-being? So we say that there is a link, and so research has established a link between one's class position and one's subjective well-being. And basically the link is, people from the upper classes tend to be happier with themselves compared to people from lower classes. So again, this isn't black and white. Not everybody from the upper class is going to be happier compared to people in lower classes. But this is the pattern that you find in the research. There is a significant link between one's class position that does provide them certain levels of subjective well-being compared to people in other class positions and their levels of personal satisfaction. So yes, the link does exist, but it's complicated. And it's complicated in the sense that you really don't know what's going on. You don't know the variables mediating this factor. In other words, what are these factors connected to your class position that make you more or less happy, that make you more or less satisfied with your life? And so previous research has started to look at some of these variables when it comes to personal satisfaction. And what you find is people have more personal satisfaction when they're kind of judging their own class position. So in other words, if you think you're part of a upper class, maybe higher than you are, that actually kind of brings you more personal satisfaction compared to looking at something objectively, kind of breaking things down formally in terms of placing people in their class position. You don't see the connection being as strong compared to when you let people put themselves into categories. So there's kind of one dimension there. It's about kind of how you think about your class position matters more than your actual class position with reference to your personal satisfaction in life. Other research has found that when you're comparing yourself to others around you, you tend to be happier compared to when you're comparing yourselves to kind of a larger kind of cross-section of the society. So basically, this research says that around you, if you feel like you're doing better class-wise compared to your neighbors, and compared to your fellow community members, then you'd be more likely to have higher levels of subjective well-being. But on the other hand, if you're comparing yourself to kind of a larger group, or if the people around you tend to be a little bit wealthier than you, then that may lead to lower levels of subjective well-being. So some earlier research start to dig into, what are the significant variables? What does make class correlate, connect to subjective well-being as a whole? So what the current research tries to add to this conversation is looking at the variables of status and power, and how these two variables together or separately mediate the relationship between social class and subjective well-being. So again, what are the factors of status and power that maybe connects to people being happier with their lives, more satisfied with their lives, or perhaps not so happy with their lives and not so satisfied? And so when we say status, basically we're conceptualizing it as respect, prestige, and admiration that others provide you. So others give you respect. They kind of see you as being special, above average, above normal, and they admire you. So basically the status is kind of a social status, how other people see you, how other people define you. On the other hand, when we conceptualize power, we're talking about the extent to which people possess and people control valued resources. So basically, you possess a lot of things that give you power. You control a lot of things that give you power. So you control the work environments when you're the boss. When you're the boss, you make a lot of money, so you possess another valuable resource, control, and then also the resources themselves in terms of money. So we're looking at kind of motives, and by motives, basically these drives that people have in life. They try to connect these different motives, these different drives to status and power. So basically, three motives they connect to status are status needs. Everybody has kind of a need to have some type of social recognition, some type of social status. And when you get that social recognition, when you receive that social status, then you are getting your needs met. Also self-enhancement. So we have these desires to kind of feel good about ourselves. And often we kind of compare ourselves to other people, compare ourselves to other situations. And in doing so, we feel good about ourselves. Basically, this is when we kind of do downward comparisons, when we look at ourselves as being kind of better than other people. And that provides the self-enhancement motive. And finally, the other drive here connected to status is belongingness. So the idea is when you have, status, when people admire you, you kind of feel like, you belong. You're part of kind of something bigger than yourself. Compared to when people don't admire you, they don't respect you, then again, you feel more like a fish out of water. You feel like you don't belong. So two motives that connect to power are autonomy and control. So basically the idea is when you have power, you have autonomy, you have freedom. When you have power, you have control. Likewise, when you don't have power, when you don't have a lot of it, you lack freedom, you lack autonomy. And when you don't have power, you lack control. So that's kind of, what they're saying is they predict that both variables, status and power, will contribute to subjective well-being, because the more of it you have, the more belongingness you should feel, the more self-enhancement you should achieve, the more you're going to meet your status needs, and the more freedom you're going to have, and the more control you're going to have. And when you meet those needs, you fulfill those drives, you should be happier as a result. So here we can look at the findings across the 5 different studies. So basically overall, they did find that both variables contribute to levels of subjective well-being. Basically, kind of the more you have of status, the more you're going to feel good about yourself, good about your life. And when you kind of look at status and power together, the same findings were there. When you kind of look at the two coexisting, And basically you find that people are happier with their lives as a result. But kind of the interesting part of the study is that power really didn't make that impact they thought it would. Now, power was not as influential when it comes to people being happier with their lives and being more satisfied with their self compared to status. So basically, they found by itself, power really doesn't do too much for you when it comes to elevating your subjective well-being. But the more status you have, more likely you will have higher levels of subjective well-being. So basically, the takeaway is by itself, power doesn't really do too much. But when you add status to power, it does enhance it. And also when you look at status by itself, again, it does correlate with higher levels of subjective well-being. So kind of, why is this going on? So we could say, why isn't power kind of connecting to subjective well-being as much as status? Basically, what they kind of predict is you're not really, getting that independence as much as you think, or maybe that independence doesn't matter too much to you in terms of being happy. Maybe you take that autonomy, that independence for granted because you're so used to it with your power. So you're not getting kind of the happiness as a result. And the same thing is with your control. Maybe you have all the control, but you're so used to being in control, it really doesn't do that much for you anymore in terms of making you a happier person. Also with power, it's not easy to observe, so, when talking about kind of your resources you control or the resources you possess, people really can't see that easily. You can try to tell people about your power by how you dress or the car you drive or the title of your job. But, it's just not as easy to see in terms of status symbols. And so I think that's part of it as well. Status is more kind of a social thing going on where power defined by kind of autonomy and defined by control is more kind of an individual thing. And individually, you may feel in control of your life, but that's not necessarily going to make you a happier person. So with status, what's going on with status, that does make you a happier person. So the more status you have, the more happier you tend to be. And basically you say that, it is something very social in nature. People for the most part like to be liked. People like being recognized as special, not as normal. People like being admired. And so when you're getting that positive social feedback, you start to feel more positive about yourself. So basically that social recognition that you are somebody significant is internalized, and you start to have a self-recognition that you are significant. And when you have that feeling of self being important, it makes you feel better. It makes you have higher levels of subjective well-being. And again, here you're kind of meeting those drives for the self-enhancement motive, for the belongingness and the status needs. When you can self-enhance, you can feel good. You're going to feel good. When you feel like you belong, you feel much better compared to if you feel like you don't belong. And if you can meet your status needs, you have a psychological ease, you can sleep well at night, compared to the alternative, when you don't have the status needs fulfilled, and then you feel uneasy, you have that psychological tension. So overall, that's how we can kind of break down the research and connect it back to the psychology of social class. Class position matters, but it's more about kind of the variables connected to your class position. Here, status is a main variable that comes into play. The higher status you have, likely the higher class position you have, but it's just not the position itself. It's not your bank account. It's often the status, that social recognition that you receive, and that makes you a happier person as a result. So for the next in-class assignment 7, basically I want you to look at kind of the other side of the coin, not how class positions shapes your social psychology, making you perhaps a happier person or not, but how people recognize class. So how social psychology recognizes class throughout social life. And so basically I ask you to do 3 things. Identify class symbolism with the working class, with the middle class, and with the upper class. So I ask you to identify kind of the symbolism for each, and then for each, basically briefly discuss how it symbolizes the class. So, you know, as an example, you could say like a Lexus automobile. And so it's an automobile, but it carries different symbolism. You just don't see it as a car. Often you see it as a car associated with the upper class. So that's what we mean when we're kind of recognizing symbolism and putting people in a class position based upon that symbolism. So do that. You know, try not to use the same thing I just did, but come up with symbolism for each class position, the working class, the middle class, and upper class, and then talk about kind of what the symbolism is, you know, how it has certain meanings that makes people think that you or somebody else is part of the working middle or upper class. So I'll leave that there for today. And if you have any questions, please let me know.